Did boundary violations sink MDMA-assisted therapy, or was there something more? In part 2 of our series, we look at what else went wrong. Welcome to the Carlat Psychiatry podcast, keeping psychiatry honest since 2003.
I'm Chris Aiken, the editor-in-chief of the Carlat Psychiatry Report.
And I'm Kelly Newsom, a Psych NP and a dedicated reader of every issue. First, an apology. We announced in the paper journal that we'd feature an interview with Kyle Greenway on ketamine-assisted therapy last week in our June 10th podcast. That has been moved to June 24 to make room for the breaking news on MDMA. This month, an FDA panel voted to reject MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. That doesn't mean the case is closed. The panel is an independent group of 11 scientists, clinicians, and patient advocates who advise the FDA. The FDA will make their final decision in August, and while there's still a chance for approval, we're not optimistic. 90% of the panel members voted against it, and the agency usually follows their advice. Sexual boundary violations, which we covered last week, were one of the reasons for the fail. Last year, we warned about this potential in a special issue on psychedelics, but we didn't anticipate it would happen under the registered eye of the clinical trial. But that was not the only problem that sank MDMA. Another was functional unblinding, which means that even though this was set up as a double-blind trial, patients and the therapist could usually tell who got the placebo.
Imagine that you sign up for an MDMA trial, and the investigator tells you that you're going to get either MDMA or placebo. By bad luck of the draw, you get the sugar pill. What are the chances that you'll be fooled, that your mind will stir itself into an altered state, and you'll believe that you got the real thing? These studies give us an answer. The chances are small. Around 16% of people who got the placebo thought they got MDMA. The other 84% guessed right. And that may have changed how they experienced or even reported their symptoms. Now imagine you're a therapist in this trial. Would you be able to tell who got MDMA versus placebo? We opened our last episode with a recording of MDMA therapy. In both the video and the audio, you see facial expressions, muscle movements, a whole mental status that is unlike anything I've encountered in an outpatient setting. So it's likely the blind was broken for therapists as well. Therapists might have been a little more exuberant about their therapeutic work, putting a little more of themselves into it if they knew that the patient got the real thing. They might have rated their patients a little better. And they might have even asked the patients to do the same, which, if we believe the anecdotal reports, they did. Some of the subjects who received MDMA said that their therapist coaxed them to report better recovery than they actually had, with the implication that they'd be helping others by getting this groundbreaking drug approved. We're going to play an example from New York Magazine's podcast cover story. It's a great series that broke the story of the MAPS therapy fiasco. All of the subjects that they interviewed said that they were told by their therapists about how lucky they were to be in this MDMA trial, and how their participation would bring this remarkable treatment to the greater world. They interviewed Mel, who described how she feigned recovery so that she wouldn't disappoint her therapists.
I started high as having severe PTSD symptoms, and I ended very low as having minimal to none.
And do you feel that that was reflective of what your lived experience was?
No. I think at the end, I had more symptoms than when I started.
Asking patients to change their answers on a rating scale is in itself a kind of boundary violation. And though it is much less harmful than the sexual violations we discussed in last week's episode, it wasn't the only boundary that was crossed in the trial. We spoke with Owen Muir shortly before the FDA decision was released. Dr. Muir is a psychiatrist who has co-authored a recent series of papers on psychedelics in the American Journal of Therapeutics.
Some of this comes from the ICER report, where they actually interviewed people who participated in the trial, both as therapists and as subjects, subsequently. And so we know there were some concerning reports of therapists saying things like, why don't you take the MDMA you have at home? Which is, of course, not something you'd like. There's no Seroquel trial that happens, but Seroquel hasn't been out in the world. They're just not like, a Seroquel subculture, etc.
Functional unblinding is a problem with a lot of rapid-acting drugs, including ketamine, and one way around it is to use a psychoactive drug as the placebo to disguise the fact that it's a sugar pill. For example, in some ketamine trials, they used a benzodiazepine as the placebo, and it's notable that in those trials, the legendary benefits of ketamine were nearly cut in half, judging by the effect size, compared to the trials that used a sugar pill or saline injection. The S-ketamine Spravato trials, by the way, did not use a benzo as the comparison. They used an inert placebo. Back to MDMA. In the case of MDMA, the FDA had advised the investigators to use such an active comparator, like niacin or a low dose of MDMA, but the company declined. MDMA can be more activating in the lower dose range, and maybe the investigators were worried that this would sink their trial by introducing yet another variable. Psilocybin, the other psychedelic nearing the approval stage, took a different route. Most of those trials used a microdose of the magic mushroom as the control.
The whole point of double-blind placebo control is to remove bias from the clinical trial. But functional unblinding is not the only reason this trial was biased. Think about recruitment. Who would be likely to sign up for an MDMA trial? Many of the subjects had tried MDMA before, and people who had had bad experiences on the drug would not have volunteered to go through another bad trip. Or maybe the investigators discouraged such patients from signing up for the trials, something a report from the Institute of Clinical and Economic Review suggests they did.
There is a strong possibility that people who had the profound experience of MDMA and enrolled in the trial such that they could hope they could get this treatment, no one's enrolling in the study for the hope that they'll get placebo. About 40% of the patients in the study had prior experience with MDMA.
Oh.
Both they had tried it before, 40% of the time, but they're from a culture where that was okay. These were people for whom it was okay to try MDMA before, and thus okay to enroll in an MDMA trial. So they had a expectancy bias, plausibly. Or, they're not squares like me.
Let's pause for a preview of the CME quiz for this episode. Earn CME credits through the link in the show notes. 1. What best describes the problem with suicidality in the MDMA-assisted therapy trials? A. Suicidal ideation was more common in the MDMA group. B. Suicidal ideation was not measured in the trial. C. Suicidal ideation emerged as a potential risk of MDMA withdrawal. D. There were reports that cases of suicidal ideation were suppressed in the trial. There were other problems with the trials. The panel worried that many involved in the research were psychedelic advocates who approached this work with a religious fervor.
MAPS was founded by a man named Rick Doblin, and Rick profoundly believes, after his own experience with MDMA, that this drug and others should be legalized. And the way he chose to advocate for that was through pursuing research into the use of MDMA as a medical treatment for post-traumatic stress disorder. So a lot of the people who've been advocating for psychedelic treatments to become medicine have used them before they were. And they had profound experiences and became convinced that they were things that should be pursued. And I wrote a series of articles in which my co-authors and I argue that the evidence actually supports that these may be potentially profoundly different treatments for neuropsychiatric conditions than our historical drugs. So you can be both, have a powerful experience and not be wrong that there's something there. And so it falls to, rigorous science to figure out, well, for whom, in what conditions, are we going to use any of these things? And MDMA is essentially first at bat to go from illegal, bad, capital E drug to medical treatment.
There's a twofold parallel strategy. One is to medicalize psychedelics for PTSD, for depression, for anxiety, for substance abuse, for other things. But the other is to change drug policy and to make these legally available to people on their own. And if they want to do it in a religious context, that's fine. If they want to do it in a therapeutic context, that's fine. If they want to do it at a party, that's okay. Yeah. Then we needed a patient population that was sympathetic to the Americans, the American population, and all that led for us to PTSD.
In his media interviews, Dr. Doblin doesn't hide the fact that his ultimate goal is to spread MDMA to the general public, and that he's starting with PTSD because it's a disorder that evokes sympathy from the public. The FDA panel gave specific examples of how religious fervor can taint a medical treatment. 1. Dr. Doblin promoted off-label use of MDMA-assisted therapy for couples therapy and for the general population, as we just heard. In a world where getting fired from your job is often construed as a DSM trauma, it's easy to see how MDMA-assisted therapy could spread far and wide. 2. One panelist accused Dr. Doblin of violating the Nuremberg Code by proposing that MDMA enroll Ukrainians housed at refugee centers into clinical trials examining MDMA-assisted group psychotherapy.
Monitoring for suicide was another setback. And this may sound strange, but you might misconstrue bad outcomes as good when you believe with religious zeal that your therapy is inherently good, even when your patient becomes suicidal. One of the leaders of the MDMA trials has been quoted as saying that increases in suicidal ideation are actually part of the process of psychedelic therapy. Some of the founders of psychedelic therapy, like Dr. Stanislav Grof, have unconventional views on suicide, like writing that suicidal ideation is explained by the deep memory of prenatal suffering being terminated by release from the womb. In the published reports, there were suspiciously 0 cases of suicidal ideation in the MDMA therapy group, but some of the MAPS therapists who spoke out anonymously painted a different picture. There was a serious suicide attempt during a dosing session that went unreported. Another patient tried to run out into traffic while on MDMA, also unreported.
This problem isn't unique to MDMA. I recall being at psychoanalytic case conferences where they would present patients who got worse during therapy and concluded that this was an example of the therapeutic law, you have to get worse before you get better. I saw similar things as a resident in the early days of SSRIs when doctors believed that these antidepressants were inherently good and did not cause mania. When we gave teens with signs of bipolar disorder an antidepressant, they would call back anxious and agitated, and the plan was usually to lower the dose and go slower, not to stop the med. The idea was that an antidepressant had to help depression. We just needed to give it more time. Then there were problems with the therapy itself. MAPS is not applying to get MDMA approved, but MDMA-assisted psychotherapy. And so, if the FDA approves this treatment, they are approving the therapy along with it. That's not something the FDA is set up to do, and these clinical trials were not set up to evaluate the efficacy of this therapy. So what is MAPS to do? On the one hand, they could have used a standard PTSD therapy like CBT or exposure-based, no controversy there, and the FDA wouldn't feel like they're unleashing an untested therapeutic technique along with a radical new drug. MAPS did not do that. They put together a therapy that critics say is an eclectic mix of a dozen different therapies loosely strung together by New Age concepts. Owen Muir points out that the manual is nearly impossible to follow in any kind of standardized way, full of poorly defined concepts like inner healing intelligence. On the other hand, the therapy that they chose does have face validity. It is based on the approach that therapists found most effective when they first developed MDMA-assisted therapy in the early 1980s. You could argue that this therapy has a stronger empirical track record to pair with MDMA than does CBT. I mean, it's been used for many decades along with MDMA, if only used underground. And I don't think there's been any studies of combined MDMA for PTSD with something like CBT. Well, in the end, the FDA panel saw this novel therapy as a negative, and the fact that this approach failed to prevent boundary violations is not a ringing endorsement for its loose eclecticism. Judge for yourself. The manual is free online. Google a manual for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy in the treatment of post-traumatic stress disorder at maps.org. Whether or not it's an effective therapy, it's a good read, a rarity for therapy manuals.
The other problem with testing MDMA with a new therapy is that we don't know if the treatment is really a major advance over existing treatments. MDMA is up for approval as a breakthrough therapy, which means it has to move the needle further than SSRIs and exposure-based treatments. The studies hint at that. Most subjects had failed past treatments and the recovery rates were very high in the 70% range. But if they had compared MDMA-assisted therapy with a therapy that is known to work, like exposure therapy, we'd be more certain that it is a breakthrough. Psilocybin did just that. They paired it with an evidence-based therapy for depression, acceptance and commitment therapy, and psilocybin was tested against an SSRI for depression, which, incidentally, it failed to beat.
People who disagree with the panel's decision might be thinking that the panel didn't understand how serious PTSD can be. But that doesn't seem to be the case. Among the ones who voted no were the Deputy Director for Research at the National Center for PTSD. In fairness, you might argue that the problem of unblinding affects other drugs as well. Many have argued that unblinding inflated the effect size of antipsychotics in mood disorders, especially those with known sedative side effects like olanzapine and quetiapine. And most companies that submit their data to the FDA don't even bother to check if the blind was broken. Psychedelics are being singled out here, and maybe they should be. After all, people don't seek out antipsychotics as recreational drugs, prison populations aside. But from a patient's perspective, antipsychotics have nearly a dozen black box warnings. Here's the bottom line. Science tries to take bias out of the trial through randomization and blinding. But those methods failed here, and the researchers had strong biases, both commercial and ideological, to favor the medication. By the way, on the commercial note, I'm not entirely sure of the company's financial structure, but it looks like they might have stood to make a profit by training people in the therapy once MDMA is released, because otherwise MDMA is a little hard to copyright. Well, everyone involved was influenced by the hype around the drug. The question that remains here is, was all this bias based on legitimate benefits of MDMA? Maybe patients expect to get a lot of benefit out of MDMA because it really is beneficial. It's a uniquely effective drug. If it is, let's get it approved and start the healing. But let's first go through more mundane motions of proving that the excitement is real, even when the blinds are in place. There is also a risk, though, of abuse and diversion with MDMA, and although we didn't see that in the published reports of the trials, they did enroll a select population, and they didn't look as hard for drug misuse as the FDA would have liked. For example, the FDA asked that they rate liking and euphoria on the drug, which they did not.
There are small groups of people here, and there are potential cardiovascular risks. We know that in amphetamines already. There's a black box warning on stimulant medications, and you give those to millions of kids, and some of them drop dead. And when you give MDMA to 120 people who have depression and PTSD but not cardiovascular conditions, you don't know what happens when you give it to someone with congestive heart failure.
MDMA can also have dangerous side effects, like psychosis, mania, and mood swings. In the 1980s, MDMA pioneers spoke of how the drug sometimes brought out dark, shadowy sides in people who took it. They tried to construe this in terms of Jungian mystic dualism as part of the progress in therapy. But what if it was just psychosis they were seeing? Well, in New York Magazine's Cover Story podcast, subjects tell of psychotic-like experiences after taking MDMA that they either withheld from the investigators so as not to spoil the chance of approval, or in some cases, once they did tell the investigators, they were told that it was part of the healing process. Things like visions and paranoid sensations. Just as dangerous, though, is the risk of boundary violations, problems that will end this therapy if they are not kept in check. And they are difficult to keep in check because therapists are likely to take the drug themselves once it gets released to general use. Imagine seeing powerful transformations in patients, working day after day with a drug that takes away not just PTSD, but self-consciousness, inhibited anxieties, the things we all struggle with. The temptation for clinicians to try MDMA on their own would be a strong one. And once people take it, their own sense of boundaries and even morality can start to shift. Not to mention that the historic roots of MDMA therapy advocate taking it on your own. We saw this play out in Timothy Leary's failed experiments in the 1960s with LSD and psilocybin, but it goes back even before then. When Dr. Leary began studying psilocybin in the early 1960s, researchers at NIMH reached out to warn him that similar experiments had gone awry at the NIMH in the 1950s when investigators started taking the drug themselves. It's a bit like the curse of the Hope Diamond. If MDA is approved in August or later, it will likely involve tight restrictions, with use in approved healthcare settings, close monitoring of patients, and diligent reporting of adverse events. And that will mean a very expensive treatment. With 2 therapists at each session, I estimate that the 12-session therapy takes about 75 hours of therapist time, which could cost anywhere from $10,000 to $20,000 for a standard 3-month treatment. Now, granted, that's not too different from what a lot of our drugs cost. And this means that we're going to need to be much more careful in assessing who is a good candidate for this type of treatment. As Dr. Muir puts it, if psychedelics get released, we're going to have to up our game as diagnosticians.
I strongly suspect that in-person care, and maybe even a physical exam or two, are going to be part of this. You're probably going to need to evaluate the heart, the lungs, the neurological exam. And part of this may be that inpatient psychiatric medicine has a renaissance because we can do these more prolonged treatments that have profound effects in a setting where someone can hang out all day. There's going to be a lot of restructuring. I think there's going to be a lot of structure. So you mentioned we don't do structured interviews now. Like, look, how much time out of your day is changed as a practicing physician prescribing olanzapine versus Prozac? And virtually none. You may get called later. You may spend a little more time on the consenting. But like, they take it at home. They're not in your office being exposed to drug. And so, it's buprenorphine we induce in the office. And so I think a buprenorphine induction is a really good kind of proxy for this. Esketamine or even a surgical evaluation. A neurosurgeon spends a while deciding whether they're going to do neurosurgery or not. It's not, oh, I'm here for the neurosurgery. Well, sure. No, they're assessing whether their intervention is more likely to be helpful or harmful. And because neurosurgery requires scheduling an OR and cutting you and having a bunch of other people in the room, and there's tons of logistics around that. And so they take it seriously in terms of risks and just hassle.
For now, MDMA remains an illegal drug in the US, Schedule 1, which means the DEA considers it to have no accepted medical use and a high potential for abuse. But MDMA-assisted therapy is approved in Australia, and other countries like Switzerland, Canada, and Israel are exploring limited compassionate use. And for patients who are determined to find it, MDMA-assisted psychotherapy is conducted underground in the US and legally in countries like Jamaica and Costa Rica. And while the FDA grapples with questions of addiction and bias, patients with PTSD await the kind of recovery that those who've gone through MDMA-assisted therapy testify to. A woman with PTSD from sexual assault testified that what used to feel like a tsunami of overwhelming panic was now merely a puddle at my feet. In the words of a military veteran, since MDMA, I have been allowed to live, to truly live. Owen Muir, MD, is an interventional psychiatrist in New York City and the editor of the Frontier Psychiatrist newsletter, which you can find on Substack. His recent articles there were among the sources for this podcast. The Carlat podcast team is now on video. Find monthly episodes of Carlat Psychiatry News on the Carlat YouTube channel or under webinars on the Carlat webpage. This month features research on TMS for teens, olanzapine serum levels, a prazosin combo pill for alcohol, how to switch sleep meds, lithium, omega-3s, and caffeine.
Thanks for watching. Hit subscribe if you enjoyed this content. And to earn CMEs for listening, head on over to thecarlatreport.com/podcast.